Well, today is the day that the streams have pretty much merged. The U.S., China, and Italy now all officially have just about the same number of Wu flu cases. China, if you might remember, was going up exponentially. At the start of this year, from January until February, and then all of a sudden at 80,000 they just flatlined. There were barely any new cases. They were adding one or two a day, and the number just completely disappeared. They got rid of the epidemic. It was gone. Now, of course, I at the time never believed any of that. Even with China's, very draconian measures, I was pretty certain that you don't just all of a sudden overnight flatten your curve, so to speak, to be an actual flat line. That's not how statistics works. And it's also just not how disease works. It's not how nature works. It's not how a virus like this would work. So I've been pretty nervous ever since then that once this gets into other countries, we'll see something very similar to like China, but it will get up way worse. Because once we hit that 80,000 mark, we're not just going to suddenly flatline like China did. Nobody will. And now the U.S. and Italy are at that point. Italy today has 80,000 cases. The U.S. has 79,000. China has 81,000. Both Italy and the U.S. will be over 80,000 tomorrow. The U.S. probably by tomorrow will become the number one country in the world, with confirmed cases. Now, of course, I'm sure China still has the most cases, in actuality, but they're never going to confirm that. In fact, because China is suppressing the numbers so low, there's only 500,000 cases worldwide of this virus. And of course, officially, the substantial portion of all those cases are outside of China. Now, the death rate of this thing is something that really is still up in the air, as far as I'm concerned. We couldn't trust the data coming out of China, so we didn't know how deadly it was, because they kind of pegged their death rate at 4%, and that's where it stayed. We don't really know what the real death rate is in China, how many people actually have died. Some people, based on I don't think I've discussed this before, but the telephone companies in China have had millions of people, I guess, disappear off of their rolls, and in China, pretty much everyone has a phone. I think that you might actually be required to by law so that the government can track you better. They actually have to force people to buy cell phones in China because they don't want to be tracked, I guess, unlike in the U.S. where everyone just does it voluntarily and lets Google and Apple know every last bit of information about them. Well, in China, these telephone companies, I guess, publish for maybe investors because they're publicly traded, I don't know, the numbers of people, of customers that they have. And I guess they didn't properly erase these people's existences to the point to where they kind of hid that these people were just disappearing off the roll. So it's possible that all these people are dead people who are unconfirmed by the Chinese government. And of course, but who knows? Because we don't even know what the real number of cases in China, let alone the real number of deaths. So the death rate coming out of China, that 4%, could be true, could be completely inaccurate. It could be that they have a death rate of 4% and just an absurd amount of cases, and they're trying to hide both of those things. I don't know. Now the case of the rate out of Italy, and again, it's tough because none of these cases are all said and done. You have a lot of cases outstanding of people who are not healthy yet. But the number that most people are dealing with, the way that people are looking at the death rate of this thing is they look at the total number of cases, including cases that are outstanding, that are unresolved, people who are still sick, and then they take that and they divide it by the number of people who have died. Or actually, it's the other way around. They take the current number of deaths versus the total number of cases, and they divide that. And so in Italy, you end up, when you do that, something like 10%, because there are 8,000 people dead in Italy and about 80,000 total cases. And so you look at that, considering that there are a lot of cases still unresolved, meaning that even if the number of cases stopped going up, even if they just hit a ceiling at 80,000 like China, the number of deaths would continue to climb because people who are sick now, some of those people are going to die. That's just as statistical reality. And so let's just take that 10% at face value. 10% is a very scary number if that's replicated elsewhere, because as infectious as this thing is, if 1 in 10 people die, that's going to be at least hundreds of thousands of people dead, probably millions, in a place like the United States. Yet in the United States, where we see the same number of cases so far confirmed, we see a much lower number of deaths. There are only about 1,200 people dead in all of the United States. Most of those, I believe, from New York, something like 400 maybe. New York, by the way, has 37,000 cases, more than most countries. But, that's not really relevant since New York is big enough to be its own country. Certainly you could compare it to a country like Italy or Spain or France in terms of its size and its population. So anyway, back to the death rates. You see the disparities between these three countries that have the same number of confirmed cases and yet very different numbers of people who are dead. Italy, of course, being the highest, the United States being the lowest, and China being somewhere in the middle. So I've already explained why China's, let alone being different from Italy and the U.S., why China's numbers are probably just very wrong. So let's look at specifically why then Italy and the U.S., assuming that they're trying to do a good job in calculating the statistics here, which is a big if, but let's say that they are. Why would their numbers be different? What is it that Italy and the U.S. are doing differently that would make their experiences with this so much different? Well, for one thing, in Italy versus the U.S., Italy's a much smaller country than the U.S. It's going to have the people are going to be much closely, densely packed to get. Or I should say the cases are much more densely packed because there's just less landmass in Italy. 80,000 cases in Italy is going to be in a smaller area than in the U.S. And what that means is that when all these cases are packed into a very tight area, even though it's the same number of cases, you're going to put a much bigger strain on the hospital system. Because if you look at Lombardy and Venetia, northern Italy, which is where the outbreak is concentrated, it's a very small area geographically. And so if you have tens of thousands of these cases in there, and they're all going to the same hospitals rather than being in hospitals spread out across, a big country like the United States, you're going to have a higher rate of death because you just can't get the same quality of care. Now, another factor, of course, is that Italy has the second oldest population in the world, older than Japan, which, of course, older people in general are going to have a tougher time dealing with this virus. We discussed that before. I also discussed the anomaly of how Japan, being the oldest, having the oldest population in the world, why aren't they getting hit by this? Potential reason for that is cultural, that, Japanese people often wear masks anyway, and so when there's a big outbreak like this, more people are probably wearing masks, but people are already wearing masks to begin with. People don't touch each other. They don't shake hands. They generally have, just very good hygiene. And so that helps on the margins, do away with a lot of this spread. Now then, why don't we have all these deaths in the U.S.? What sets the U.S. apart from Italy, other than the fact that these are spread out? But even though it's more spread out than it is in Italy, if you look at New York, has 37,000 cases, you would think that would be overwhelming their hospital system pretty quickly. Because let's say that's about half of what Italy has. Italy was still overwhelmed when they were at 40,000 cases versus 80,000. Now they're just more overwhelmed than they were back then. And so, as far as I'm concerned, there's way too many variables to try and calculate for me to, on the back of the envelope, really figure out why Italy has such a higher death rate, other than differences that people have pointed out in how the deaths are calculated. Italy, if you catch this virus and then you end up, dying and you have some other comorbidity, they're going to count you as being killed by the virus if, say, let's say you're a diabetic and the virus exacerbates your diabetes and you die of for diabetic reasons. They're still going to say that the virus killed you because had you not caught the virus, you wouldn't have died. Whereas in the U.S. and other countries, apparently they don't do things that way, even though that's what makes sense to me, what Italy's doing, that if somebody catches this virus and it exacerbates a pre-existing condition that they have and makes it worse to the point to where it kills them, it still seems pretty clear to me that the virus is what pushed you over the edge. Even if you didn't die of suffocating because the virus destroyed your lungs, you still are someone who would have been alive if you had not caught the virus. And so maybe the U.S. is doing something similar, although frankly I can't believe that it would be that big of a disparity, because if we had that many people getting sick and dying of this virus, You would think that even anecdotally that would become more clear to people, because if you look at the situation in Italy, even without looking at the numbers, it's very dire. And in the U.S., there's not that same level of desperation. You don't have these scenes in hospitals of people overflowing everywhere in New York City yet. And so the only thing I can really think of is that because even though this is concentrated in a small area, if you look at the infection rate as a percentage of the population, which I can't get reliable data on northern Italy to know exactly how many people are in these places, but I'm going to say that in a place like Milan, or let's say just say Milan. Milan's definitely smaller than New York City. And so when you have thousands and thousands of cases in these smaller communities that don't have very big hospitals, that aren't equipped to treat thousands and thousands of people, well, then you're going to get overwhelmed faster. Whereas in New York, since it's such a densely populated city anyway, let's just say all those 37,000 people are all in New York City, which I believe they mostly are, although that's throughout the whole state of New York, so there are people outside of New York City included in that number. But let's just say 37,000 people in the city of New York. There's millions and millions of people in New York. They have a lot of hospitals, and so they're set up to deal with, on a regular basis, much more people in the hospital. They're better equipped to handle this. So this isn't as making on a relative basis, it's not making as big of a dent, even though it is very significant. It is putting a significant load on the system. So I think that makes it clear why it's so unclear, or why we have different numbers in these three countries despite the same number of cases, why you have so much variation in the death rate. And it's just that there's so many variables here, including how things are tested. And I even talked about testing in the U.S. and the difference between in the U.S. and Italy as far as the testing regime goes. But actually, let's get into that, because as I've been talking about, Trump has been signaling that he's very worried about the economy. He's shifting in focus from being worried about the virus to being worried about the economy. Downplaying the role and sort of distancing himself from people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who have been rather apocalyptic, or if not apocalyptic, very dire in their warnings about this virus and about the measures that must be taken in order to curb it. Trump has now been pushing for a gradual reopening of the country so that our economy doesn't totally collapse. And again, this is something that even though I'm very worried about this virus, I think it's going to be terrible, I do also understand that how fragile the U.S. economy really is. And that's something that, frankly, Trump, I don't think did realize, or at least if he does realize it, he's been lying about it, because he's been saying this is the strongest economy ever. That's just not true. And so if you shut down the economy all at once for a very short period of time, that can break everything. And frankly, I think that that things probably already are pretty badly broken. But in order, the sooner we start putting things back together, then that obviously is the better for all of our situations. And of course, I've been very worried about the growth of a potential police state that was going to blossom from this whole situation. I thought it was just a great opportunity for the government to come in and seize all sorts of freedoms that we would never get back. Just shutting down the whole country, and that is a very extreme measure. And telling people to stay in their homes or else we'll shoot you in the street would have been a very, very scary place if we ever got there. But thankfully, we didn't get there, and it looks like Trump will never get there. He does not want to do that. At least not on a national scale. You see, these other countries like Italy and France just did national lockdowns. And Trump, I think, has gotten to the point to where he realizes that it would be disastrous for him to implement that. So he's not going to do it, but we are going to see small-scale lockdowns across different localities. And so to that end, Trump, I guess, announced today that there's going to be, from the federal government, rankings of every county in America on their risk level associated with the virus. And so whether they're high, medium, or low risk. So my guess is in the high-risk counties, you're going to see very stringent lockdowns, very little economic activity. In the medium, risk counties, you're going to see maybe shutting down bars and restaurants, that sort of thing, and trying to do your social distancing thing. And then in your low-risk counties, you're probably going to see ordinary economic activity, as if with no restrictions and nothing wrong. And while I think that this is a much better way of handling it than doing a national lockdown, it makes me happy to see that we're not, I don't think that it's going to stop the spread of the virus. Given the way that the U.S. has handled this so far, I don't think that it will be enough, and that the situation with the virus will get much worse. And so, yes, obviously, I'm selfish because I'm a young person and I don't have as much, even though I still am very concerned about getting this. I don't want to get it. I'm not as concerned as certain other people in the population should be about getting this virus. But at the same time, my I guess joy at hearing this, that there's not going to be a national lockdown, is informed by a greater fear of the consequences of the lockdown. The first consequence of that is, of course, giving more power to the federal government and the erection of a national police state. That's something I've discussed before. I won't get into it again. And the second thing is, of course, with shutting down the U.S. economy, you threaten the livelihoods and the lives of perhaps a lot more people than the virus would, if left to its own devices. And that's because without an economy, without production, people don't have food to eat. Because don't think that over any period of time that if you shut down everything except for, say, trucking, food production, grocery stores, that those things won't be affected. That there will be no containment by shutting down everything else. That just creates a whole lot of chaos, and you can't run the country essentially. If you say, oh well, we'll just give everyone EBT cards so they can go get free food, and you have food stamps essentially. You can't run an economy on food stamps. This will create a whole lot of problems, from inflation to a whole host of other things. And in order to contain this virus, you're going to need to be locked down for, a very long time. It will destroy the fabric of our society because, don't think that the economy is just about GDP. GDP isn't really about anything. GDP is a fake number, doesn't mean anything. But the relationships and the actions that people take, the way that people live on a day-to-day basis, that sense of purpose, all of this, is a part of the economy. And, if you tell people to just quit doing things for a month and then tell everyone, okay, now we're going back to work, well, where do you start? It will take a long time to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And that's assuming that there isn't a financial crisis, which of course there will be. A financial crisis, I think that our society can handle, because at least then the social fabric will still be intact. All these businesses that are not super indebted, for the most part, will still be able to exist after a financial crisis. But if whole communities across this country will be wiped out if we really do have a total shutdown. So while I do think that the U.S. is far past being able to contain this, because again, if you had an effective strategy for containment, then doing this whole only locking down certain counties would be fine. But we're well past this stage. The virus is endemic in our community, so therefore counties that are low risk now, if they're not locked down, will become medium and eventually high risk counties later as the virus spreads and just becomes embedded throughout more and more of the population. Obviously, New York is going to be the highest risk area because it's the highest population center in the country, and so you've got the most amount of people interacting with each other, and it's going to spread the fastest. But, don't be mistaken, this will spread to other places eventually too. Now, I didn't have time to get into the stimulus bill today, but I will be discussing that probably tomorrow, because I expect that the House is going to pass it before the weekend. So once that's all said and done, and once everything's finalized, and once we have a final bill, I will talk about that again, just like I did yesterday. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day, and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.